use the cliche 80-20. They're thinking that the proof of concept is the 80 and the 20 is getting into production.
Right.
But like the reality is that the proof of concept is the 20 and you're still just getting started to get that.
Mike Stringer, thanks for joining me here on the podcast. Always good to see you.
Oh, great to see you too. Thanks for having me.
The genesis of this conversation is we were chatting about the newly crowned best pizza in Chicago and went back over to Pequod's, for me at least, for the first time in a long time. So local Chicago fans, if you haven't been back in a while, it's just as good as you remember and better. And if you're not in Chicago, I don't know, maybe they ship frozen, not a paid sponsor, but would love to be. So shout out to Pequod's. But we were talking about I guess nothing short of the insane hype that LLMs like, ChatGPT and others are getting right now. And kind of in some ways how that's maybe beneficial to business, but in other ways, like maybe we're investing in the wrong direction. And so maybe for context, I'd love for listeners who aren't familiar with you to just kind of give us a quick, how you grew up in machine learning and AI and how we got to today with you.
Yeah, absolutely. So to talk a little bit about that journey, I went to grad school in physics, and like many people who do physics was mostly involved in doing data analysis. And actually I kind of got it bitten by the bug of doing things like natural language processing. And I was studying at the time complex networks. So doing this computational work in grad school, I loved doing that. And one of my colleagues and friends and I, after grad school, we started a company called Datascope that was doing data science consulting. This was in 2009. So at the time it was the rage was big data, maybe not quite as much hype as LLMs are getting today, but still quite a lot. I mean, I remember everybody getting very excited about Moneyball. And so Datascope was a data science consulting firm. We actually very quickly learned that when we would talk with prospective clients, we thought we were going to be kind of crunching the numbers and doing kind of like big data analysis stuff. Almost never did they really know what the opportunities might be for doing that. So we'd often have to do a lot of work up front to try to identify, are there ways to use data that is useful to create new products, services, whatever, solve organizational problems. And pretty quickly, we started seeing what we were doing at Datascope as not just kind of an analytical data science type of activity, but instead we were trying to help our clients ask the right questions or even figure out what to do in the first place. And we saw that as kind of like a form of design. We really were thinking about how do you design things with data. Mm-hmm. And we actually took a lot of inspiration from the design firm IDEO, who had an office in Chicago. We got to know them really well. And over the years, as we grew closer and closer with them, and then eventually in 2017, they bought Datascope. And so Datascope became kind of the seed for a new discipline within the design firm IDEO. Mm-hmm. So there, I led that data science practice, trying to build it in all of our global locations. And all through this time, kind of working on not necessarily like R&D type of work around data science, but really kind of like taking things that might have been R&D like a couple years before and applying them. So yeah. That is often kind of like, it's now possible, like say in 2009, it was a big thing around like using these distributed computing systems like Hadoop. It's like, all right, well, now that's getting pretty easy to apply. Let's use Hadoop to do all this like document processing or classification systems. And over time, I think a lot of those projects ended up being related to personalization, or you see this broad industry shift from people offering products to offering services instead. So software as a service, but also we would talk with companies that are interested in, I don't want to be a pet food company. I want to be a pet health company. And that would involve a shift to kind of services where it's like, you want to understand something about people's pets, for example. So maybe a bit of a long-winded. Now
No,
I'm
it's great. It's great. And it reminds me of, I feel like, having been like in this, tech services space for a while, there are these cycles of, buzzwords that I end up hearing as they get turned into verbs. And, it's like, we got to blockchain this, and then we got to moneyball this. And now we've got to, chat GPT this. And I think it's at the risk of a cliche, it's like when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And so when I experience the hype side of it, like we're not starting with problem first. We're starting with like literally shiny thing first, and like where can we put it? And I feel like some of the situations we've encountered, they're sort of like really strange applications of the current shiny thing, and that's sort of unusual. And I like your story about like moving back to the business problem we're trying to solve here. So maybe kind of fast forwarding in the current world of when ChatGPT is now a verb that people are GPTing things.
Yeah.
We were kind of chuckling about it a little bit, but like for you, like what's a category of things you think maybe it does pretty well, and what's a category of things that maybe that's not the right hammer for that job?
I'll say at the outset that it is. I don't think I can genuinely make blanket statements. I think everyone's kind of trying to figure out what these things are good for and what they're not.
Yeah.
And I'm in that same boat as everyone else. Like, I don't claim to have that particular answer, but there are some examples of things that I see them being particularly useful for.
Okay.
Like, I think we chatted about it a bit over pizza, but I remember a project that we did in 2012-ish, around there. So say a little over a decade ago. And it involved trying to take a lot of text from the internet and summarize and classify it. And that was a huge project. If I remember correctly, like there were portions where it's kind of like, all right, well, we're working on that for 8 months, kind of trying to develop these systems to do that. And they worked pretty well. Always the biggest challenge with those was always like, how do you not lose people's trust when it's wrong? It's inevitably wrong. So that still is the case. It was the case then, and it's still the case. But I look at that and I see the way that you can build some classification tools like that using models that are on sites like Hugging Face or something, where you can just kind of, if you know enough to get an environment set up for programming, you can kind of download these open source tools, glue them together, and have something that's better than what we were making 10 years ago with 8 months of effort and like a few afternoons. It's kind of not mind blowing. It's like, well, it's better. It's not actually that much better, but it's so much easier that it can be applied in a much broader set. I mean, that project that I'm referring to, it's like important enough to our client that they're willing to invest in like, year plus projects of a lot of people working on it. So it was a really valuable problem to be working on. But now I think about, if people can throw together these things that can do that type of thing with just a week of work as a prototype and actually build something in like an order of a month, now it's like, it kind of lowers the floor. And there's like a lot more industries, a lot more like maybe smaller problems that aren't quite so high value, but
absolutely,
but ways of applying this in like medium-sized businesses, where it was kind of like big businesses with huge scale were the ones where it was making
it would have
the
been
most
totally
sense
inaccessible for those businesses 5 or 10 years ago. And I think, to your point, like this allows people to experiment with, there's probably like a long tail of ideas that it's like, is that really worth investing a lot in? Well, now if you can, to your point, you can assemble things just from, publicly available models or Hugging Face. I was at dinner with someone recently who was in a financial services space and built a tool for his like 80 customers using like a make.com, a ChatGPT interface, a PDF, like a bunch of things. Like it would never really work in production, but he's like, I just needed it for 100 people. I was able to do it in a few days, and he's not a developer. And it's like, that's such a, like, that never would have, it wouldn't have been in the realm of possibility to build that and have it make sense 10 years ago. And so, I feel like the opportunity is like some of these because he was automating something that is really tedious and silly and great application of the available technology, and didn't have to do things that would require, that would create a problem if they were wrong, to your point. I feel
Yeah.
like with LLMs, like with any model like that, it's like, I feel like to a certain extent, you still need to be the editor final say on like what this stuff actually is. But like, God, it's such a great, like there's probably tens or hundreds of thousands of those kind of opportunities now that you can experiment with. And maybe then in the realm of enterprise, it's a great way, to your point, of like, well, let's do a proof of concept here and see if people like it. And then we'll invest the 8 to 12 months to build something. Does that kind of resonate for you?
Big time. And I mean, maybe to highlight something you said around like it would never work in production, I think that's an important thing to kind of flag, is that I think it is surprisingly easy to do that proof of concept. And I do think that a lot of people are underestimating. They're maybe thinking that it's like, if we go use the cliche 80-20, they're thinking that the proof of concept is the 80 and the 20 is getting into production.
Right.
But like the reality is that the proof of concept is the 20 and you're still just getting started to get that to be something that's really reliable.
Yeah.
So I think that that's a under talked about obstacle right now, is because everybody's making these proofs of concept, but there's not very many people that are successfully going from the proof of concept to something that's in production. And that's a difficult problem, as it always has. It's a software development, software engineering. That's a
really
problem.
Great insight, because I do feel like it, to the sort of the layman, it seems like we're almost there.
Yeah.
Right? It's like, wow, this, like, we're, all we have to do is now we just operationalize this, and I don't know, what do we do? Get more servers? Do we? No, it's a totally different process, but it's still that now we're sort of in the land of like actually engineering it to do something. That's really interesting. One of the things you talked about that I'm really curious about is I feel like the promise of personalization seems to be really interesting to me. And I'm curious, like, what are some things happening today that like pique your interest about personalization concepts, and like where AI might help us do that better?
Yeah. I mean, that's a great question. And personalization, I mean, it's such a huge area. We've gotten so accustomed to it that we're almost not noticing how ubiquitous it is in the things that we use. Do you know the book Diamond Age by Neil Stephenson by any chance?
It's just too bad, because I love that author. I don't think I know that book.
So it's got this concept in it that it's called like the Young Ladies Illustrated Primer. Okay. It's this book. It's like kind of a super high tech book that adapts to everything that the reader needs to know. Sure. So it's kind of like it understands what level they're at and like kind of meets them there. It's like a very personalized experience. And actually, I think an important element of the book is that there's a strong emotional connection, which maybe I think is actually really relevant, but doesn't get talked about very much. But I've actually heard this huge uptick in the past 6 months or so. It's like I've heard a lot of people talking about that book, because if you've read that book, you can't help but seeing like Claude or ChatGPT and like seeing little glimmers of that Young Ladies Illustrated Primer.
Sure.
But I do think that that's where the reason I mention it is that there's so much that goes into personalization in order for it to be meaningful. Mm-hmm. That's not just like, you listened to this, so you might like that. Yeah. There's a lot that goes into actually having that be meaningful, that involves understanding what's actually useful about personalization. Yeah, because it can feel derivative, or it can feel expansive and creative. It's like the famous example about like, if you buy a toilet seat on Amazon, the next week it says you might also like a toilet. No, that was it. That was the one I buy every decade, right? Yeah. So I'm curious, are you a fan of anything? So you said like, maybe we're not noticing it. Are you a fan of anything you have noticed? You're like, oh, that was really good. I think this is not necessarily, actually, this isn't personalization, but I think one thing I've noticed is actually, if you go shopping on Amazon and you see the reviews, the product reviews, it used to be the case that they've been trying for a long time to summarize. If a product has thousands of reviews,
Sure.
They try to summarize those. And actually, you know how there's sometimes those funny product reviews on Amazon? There's like a gallon of whole milk. There's a Tuscan whole milk is one that you can look up on Amazon. It has probably at this point, maybe even hundreds of thousands of reviews that are all just people joking around.
Yeah.
I remember several years ago that the summary that they had is like, here's what customers think about this product. And it was trying to summarize those 10,000 reviews. And it's like,
Right.
If you rearrange the letters of Tuscan whole milk, it spells "I'll know mustache." That was like, it was like, that's as good as they were able to do. It was not a very helpful summary. But now if you look at those, I mean, summarization of these pretty big bodies of text is something that it's really good at doing, especially if you kind of seed it with the right prompts, give it the right types of guidance about how to do that, then it does a great job summarizing. And now if you look at those summaries, like they're actually pretty helpful. So I think that's like an area of like, you don't notice it. I'm just speculating. Maybe I'm way off and they're not using LLMs for that. I think there's a possibility that that's true, but I kind of doubt it because it has that like kind of smell.
For sure.
Like so I think it's a great example of, all right, that's a way of taking all this information and like summarizing it in a way that's actually useful for making a decision about.
Yeah. I feel like I see a lot of it in entertainment, like with streaming services or other places where we're trying to keep you engaged, and therefore, kind of things you've watched kind of map to this other thing. And that doesn't feel incredibly personalized just because it feels like math, Yeah. But I feel like every now and then you get something that's like someone connected an unnoticed connected dot that I didn't realize. And I feel like I had this debate with my kids the other day, and it's like, this may be a hot topic for debate. Which streaming service does the best job of taking the 10 songs I just listened to and then extending into it, whatever. And for some reason, we all agreed Spotify was the one that did the best with, if I give you a sample size of 10, I'm going to nail 11, 12 and beyond. And, it feels like it's the same math problem between them and Apple and whoever else, but something they're doing, they've figured out something about, the interactions of all the different people. And I wonder if it's because I would imagine something like whoever has the most number of active users can have the best data to do that. But that feels more personalized. And maybe that's one of those invisible things that you don't quite see happening. But when you compare it to something, you're like, oh, theirs is better. I don't know why,
Yeah. Well, this is where my design hat comes on.
Okay.
I agree. I think Spotify is a really great example of what can be done with personalization. They have been for quite some time. One thing that I think we take for granted now, and other people have emulated, but Spotify was really the first of those services that used playlists as the way that they offered personalization. I mean, if you think about any other types of recommendations, it's almost always like, we think you'll like this, or you listen to this, so why don't you try this? That was the format for doing it. Spotify started offering playlists like Discover Weekly, Release Radar, and now it's like all over the place. They use the playlist as the fundamental way of making recommendations.
Yeah.
And that was a design choice that has really profound implications for even the technical approach to the way that you create those algorithms. Now, instead of using like a particular error metric that's like, what's the most likely for someone to listen to next? Now it's like, well, we're offering a set, and maybe we're thinking about engagement in a different way. Like maybe when we offer these 12, it's okay if it's wrong. Like maybe even 10 of the times, if somebody's kind of pumped that they found 2 new songs that they're into on Discover Weekly, the fact that it's called Discover Weekly gives them a lot of latitude to be wrong in ways that other recommendation systems don't have, because they're not thinking about it in that way. They're not thinking like, oh, what's the listener going to be expecting? And so I see that, and I actually don't think, and again, I'm kind of speculating, but I don't think that it has to do as much with the scale and something technical and something about the data. I actually think
it's the design choice of the
the
list. That's really interesting.
it's like approaching it holistically and
yeah.
and continuing to do that. And I think that's I mean having you can learn about Spotify's even their organizational structure, and I think that they've built in a lot of ways of organizing the company that actually affords those things working together in ways that other organizations haven't.
That's really, I'd love to dig into this, the idea of like the design thinking approach, because when I think about like combining a couple ideas you've talked about, so design thinking and also like something kind of having the smell of an AI kind of solution. I feel like when we encounter, working with clients on problems, there's something that kind of smells like it probably has some sort of solution that looks like X, Y, or Z. And then there's a knee jerk to, oh, it must be this, or it must be that. And just thinking about like this idea of like the list, I find LLMs to be particularly useful where I say, give me 17 ideas to talk to Mike about and it'll give me, of the 17, 4 are utter garbage, 7 are not too bad. And now I'm pulling them out of it. And to your point, if it was a playlist, I'd be like, oh, I never knew this song, or this, like that expecting that kind of result sets you up to succeed more, as opposed to, oh, we're going to use the LLM to pick the right price out of the data model to offer to the customer. Like, I don't know, maybe that's rolling the dice on one thing. Is that, tell me about like approaching problems like that and how we might be better to.
I mean, I wholeheartedly agree with kind of setting the expectations to allow for mistakes. And again, that's not a new concept. There's no, like, it's so easy to lose trust in any sort of algorithm that's making recommendations when it shows you something where it's wrong and you can't even understand why it's wrong.
Yeah.
So figuring out ways to avoid those kind of like trust busting elements has always been an important element of how you develop the algorithms or design the interface.
Well, can you dig into that? Can you talk about if people were to, because I think a lot of people are now all excited. They're excited to think about what they can do with AI and models. What's a realistic way to approach the trust of the output of systems like these that can kind of help you realistically adjust your expectations to be useful, not to always be disappointed or combative or this doesn't work? Like how do we educate ourselves about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think hopefully this doesn't come across as too kind of like cliche, but I think having the mindset of these algorithms like augmenting our work, like so thinking about a person or an organization and thinking about how can this algorithm aid the person who's doing that versus automate this particular part of it. It's kind of a small distinction. It's hard to, I mean, it's easy to say like, well, yeah, okay, you're automating that thing. That's augmenting the way I'm doing it, whatever.
Right.
But I don't think it's just a semantic difference. It's like, if you approach it and think, I think it's wildly I mean, many people are like, oh, look at these, like, look at Copilot, look at writing assists.
Yeah.
They're going to make people so much more productive. And then you can see like, oh, we're going to be able to spend so much less money on people. That's like where that excitement's coming from. The reality is like, even the kind of most biggest productive bumps that we're seeing from those they're not huge. It's not like a programmer becomes 50% more productive using
like
these tools.
5 or 10%. Yeah.
Yeah. And so it's like, and that's when they practice a lot using it. And so I think a lot of the things that has kind of felt scary is like, oh, there's this big discontinuous jump where all of a sudden like people get way more productive and people are going to lose their jobs. But the reality is like, it's actually still a pretty gradual transition as we learn about how to use these new tools. And during those transition periods, which there are lots of precedent over the past 50 years for these types of transition periods, if you approach it thinking like, all right, there's a person that's still doing this thing, and we're going to use these as tools to assist the person in doing that thing, it just creates a very different mindset about what you're expecting out of it.
That's such a good point, because it's when you come at it thinking we're going to wipe this whole department out, you set yourself up to fail, because that's just really not within reason. And I
Yeah.
think about, having done this for a long time, like when I think about the evolutions in the technology that aids us, it's, I remember, you said, had a project that, something you could do today pretty quickly took 8 months. I remember coding stuff in Notepad before IDEs, and then IDEs come along, and then, libraries come along, and then all these things. And this is, I feel like, just the next evolution of, from the coding side, here's something that can suggest something, but like you could never use it. The output that comes out of it just directly, we never want people to use, right away.
Yeah.
I love the expectation setting. I'm curious. So, do you know the book, Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow? Kind of, okay. So like, I feel like the promise could be eliminating some of the thinking slow stuff that this people just aren't good at, but the fast part of the judgment about what, like, I feel like, writing the 100 lines is hard, but if I see it, okay, I'll use this, that part we're really good at. And that's where the, your 10% comes from. Does that feel right from a, like expectation point of view to you?
I think so. I know of Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow, and even did read it at some point. I'm not sure if I have the full, if I can like draw the line and say like it's the slow versus fast.
Yeah.
But yes, based on what I remember about that,
Yeah.
I think that I agree with that.
So without being too pedantic, for the benefit of anyone listening, here's my summary. So correct me in the comments and blast me. But I feel like it's something like, there are some things that take us a lot of effort to do, like go write an essay on the history of, George Washington. It's, that's a lot to do. But, what's 10 plus 12? Like that, you've got 22, right? And so you've got things that your brain does really well. Describe your third grade teacher. I've got it, And so there are things that like we do that we're wired up to do better or worse. And I think for me, ideation is one of them. That's why I love using it for that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah, I do feel like I butchered that summary. So probably kind of a case in point. I bet if you asked, Perplexity to go do a summarize Thinking Fast and Slow, it would do better than either of us.
Well, another way I find helpful to think about, and a distinction that I think is a really nice distinction to make, is like, there is like when you're programming or doing anything, like you want to be doing the right thing.
Yeah.
There's a difference between doing the right thing and then doing that thing right. What I think these tools are currently really helpful in doing, and where they provide the biggest boost, is when you actually have already identified like what the right thing is to do, and you kind of need to do it right. Like that's where like a lot of the rote tasks and the boilerplate type of stuff comes down to just like, all right, now I know what I'm doing and I need to execute on it.
Yeah.
But
right.
That's not the hard part. The hard part is always doing the right thing. You have to, like, if you're not doing the right thing to begin with, then like you're wasting time in the first place. And that's where there are some patterns of using, like what you mentioned around like using it as kind of an ideation partner or brainstorming, using it where it really is kind of serving your needs. It's like, oh, like I'm trying to explore this, what I could possibly do, and it's going to help me. And in doing that, I'm increasing the chances that I do the right thing. That's a great pattern, but still mostly you need to have, like you need to know what the right thing is to do. And that involves like a world knowledge that LLMs don't have.
The judgment piece is not there and probably won't be anytime soon. Yeah.
No, it's not. I mean, it's not built into the way that they work. There's nothing about it in the way that they work. So we shouldn't expect them to have world knowledge when that's not how they're built.
Yeah, sure. So maybe as a closing thought here, I'm curious, as the bubble probably inevitably just, recedes from wherever it is right now. And have you ever seen that Gartner hype curve? We're in the peak and it's going to level out and then there's acceptance and whatever. What do you think what are the interesting problems that sort of more of the work that you've done in the past? What are the problems you're most interested in solving, say in the next 5 years is?
Let's see. That's a great question. I mean, I think I'm excited. I think that this kind of opening up of the aperture that recent changes in technology have had will create an opportunity for smaller businesses or businesses in industries that aren't like really tech savvy digital first or haven't gone through like digital transformation kind of like, I think it'll open up opportunities. And I guess I've always been pretty excited by that. It's like, oh, I always like reading, it's like when you read about how like farmers are using technology, or like I remember reading about like this really interesting shrimp tracking system. And it's like, wow, what a fascinating use of this technology. I mean, it's kind of vague, but I do think that kind of like, wow, what are going to be the areas of applying this where people haven't really been thinking about technology as a major asset to begin with? Another thing that's not really related to LLMs is I really think that simulation, like I'm of the age that I grew up playing SimCity.
Sure, me too.
And like, I'd like to, an area that I think might be exciting is like, what would a 2025 SimCity look like? How much more detail could we get in simulating something? And how would that change the way that we think about, like, I mean, if it's a city, like, I mean, it's like, now I guess it's kind of a lot of people in urban planning were like total SimCity geeks. Like, what would it look like to bring some new technologies to bear, to have new kind of simulated environments? That's something that I think all through the past 15 years, there's been a lot of times where that was a powerful tool on projects that we were doing. And I only see that becoming more important over time.
I feel like that plus that layer of, uber personalization leads to like, immersive experiences through gaming, that this sort of like the promise of we have been written about for years and maybe actually somewhat possible in the next decade or something like that,
Yeah. I know that we're wrapping up, but simulation has kind of been in, like, there's rockets or like wind tunnels, kind of things that are these huge expensive things have always have been economically worth it to create detailed simulations.
Oh yeah.
And I guess I see the potential in the same way that we talked about LLMs opening up the space of possible applications for classification of text and images and video.
Yeah.
I wonder if there will be a similar opening up of the space of application outside of just these like huge expensive things that it's worth it to build a simulation.
1,000%.
Like,
yeah.
oh, maybe we can simulate like littler things, and that might be really interesting to improve them.
I think a theme here is, your example of farming and shrimp is like these tools will, and other, technology tools will find their ways into corners that used to be just thought of as like, that's not a technology problem.
Yeah.
Excuse me. Not a technology problem, but like now it's affordable to try it and see. And like, even like, a lot of our work is in mid-market companies where, the idea of building software 10 years ago, like, oh, that's not for us. That's, for someone else. And now it's like, actually, you can probably do this, and we can do something interesting and long tail for you that maybe never was possible before. I think it's really, it's an exciting time to be able to do that.
Yeah.
Well, so I think if anything, homework, I got to go read, or was it Diamond H, right?
Oh yeah. I highly recommend it.
That's a good one. And then maybe we'll reread Thinking Fast and Slow, Daniel Kahneman.
And
all good stuff, trying to keep up. And note to Pequods, we are available for sponsorship if that ever comes available. But Mike, as always, really fun talking about this as always. And we'll send you some follow-up on this when we release it live. So hope everyone enjoyed that, and great seeing you again.
Yeah. Good seeing you. Thanks for inviting me.